Hello, fellow heretics. My name is Mark, and today we're gonna paint one of my favorite supervillains from Marvel Crisis Protocol, Magneto. To start off our painting process, we will be priming Magneto and the sub-assemblies I've made with black primer. You can use any black primer that is suitable for plastic, but I personally prefer Chaos Black by Games Workshop. Make sure you prime the model in a well-ventilated area. Alternatively, you can use an airbrush to prime the miniature. The choice is up to you. I've decided to base coat and paint the red areas as the first step of painting Magneto. When painting a miniature, I find it important to tackle the most prevalent color first. To paint the red parts of the costume, we will need 6 colors, as you can see shown here. I will be using a wet palette as it is a great miniature painting tool that will keep our paint workable for long painting sessions, as well as keep our paint mixes ready to use throughout the process. We will start by giving the red areas a couple of coats of the shadow tone, as I like to work my colors up from darkest to lightest. For this, we will mix 1 part black, 1 part burnt red, and 1 part purple, and apply it in multiple thin coats. I suggest doing at least 2, however the consistency of the paint depends on the mix. For the first red base layer, I will add more burnt red to the mix. This will allow us to gradually increase the color on the red parts of the costume. Remember, the smoother you want your transitions to be, the more color mixing you need to do. I will gradually add more and more burnt red until I'm happy with the brightness and saturation of the red. If you're a beginner, saturation basically means presence of color. I tend to apply paint until the color on the miniature has the same color as of that on my palette. At this stage, our miniature looks quite desaturated. This is because I still have the black from the original mix in my paint. We will fix this with upcoming highlights. For the purple, we will use 4 paints: Laser Magenta, Magenta, Wine Red, and Black, all from AK Interactive. We add black to make the shadow layer less saturated and be more blendable, if that's a word, with our primer. This is done to achieve smoother transitions. As a side note, whenever you add black or white to your paint mix, it will make said mix less vibrant and saturated, so avoid adding pure white for highlights, for example. Unless that is of course what you're going for. We want to base coat the parts of the suit that are purple. I will spend extra time on the cape as it's such a prominent part of the model. Here we want to make sure that our paint is well thinned and apply multiple layers, allowing each layer to dry before applying the next one to get a smooth transition of colors. At this point, blending should be easy as we are applying more magenta and red very slowly. As for other parts, we will gradually apply the highlight towards the light source, in our case coming from the top and slightly to the left of the miniature. We use the same technique of application as for the cape. This is my favorite part of painting a model, adding highlights. This is where we can really see our model come to life and show off the sculpt by adding more volumes. For the second layer of red highlights, I will be switching out my palette paper and mixing in burnt red and matte red from AK Interactive. No more black color in this mix. I am now switching to paints that do not contain any black in them to make our colors as vibrant and juicy as possible. For this highlight stage, we want to focus only on about 50% of the previously colored areas. For example, on the abs, we want to paint only the upper half of the ab versus the entire thing in the previous step. At this stage, our paint colors are quite different and you can say I'm skipping a few layers of transitions even. That means that we have to be extra careful with our paint application. Make sure the paint is properly thinned, a bit more than usual. It's more like a heavy glaze consistency. For the purples, we will be mixing magenta and laser magenta in equal quantities and adding a bit of wine red to keep the colors consistent with our previous mix. This is done to tie the colors together. As you can see, this is an amazing, vibrant color, so we want to be careful with our application as well to get smooth transitions. Patience is key here. Do not rush, wait for each layer to completely dry. If you don't wait for the previous layer to dry, you run the risk of lifting the paint layer and creating unwanted textures. Same goes for the cape. In fact, after I had my highlights sketched in, I grabbed Voluptuous Pink from Games Workshop, a contrast paint to smooth out the transitions. Games Workshop contrast paints work great as glaze to smooth out transitions and create gentle gradients. To finish off the red, I will be adding AK Interactive Scarlet to the previous mix, about 1 part. This highlight will be focused on the most extreme highlights and the very top of creases and folds. Do not overdo this step, we just want to give the miniature a bit of color before finishing it off. For the extreme highlight, I will be adding Games Workshop Trollslayer Orange to the final mix, again picking it out only to the most raised details and using it to exaggerate the previous highlight. This is done to add more vibrance to the miniature as well as bring the viewer's attention to the sculpt. And to finish off the purple color, we will add more magenta and laser magenta to the previous mix, only applying it to the most raised sections, about 20% of the surface area. Be very careful with the amount you are applying, as this is a very vibrant color. For the final highlight, I will add a bit of Ice Yellow by Vallejo to highlight the most prominent creases and edges. Take your time and try to paint your lines as thin as possible. To finish off the costume, we will be using a technique called blacklining. Blacklining is a technique that uses an almost black color to thinly paint lines between details. This helps us make the miniature crisp and easy to read. If you feel that you can't draw very thin lines with this mix, I suggest you use either Games Workshop contrast paints or oil paints, as the oil paints can be erased with a bit of enamel thinner. Take your time and do not paint lines too thick, or you run the risk of ruining your previous work. Our final step in painting the miniature will be painting the face. Since the face is not very clearly seen on the miniature, we will just use 4 main colors, and they are all from Games Workshop. To start, give the face an all-over coat of Bugman's Glow. After this is dry, apply 1 layer of Reikland Flesh Shade. Make sure to let it dry before proceeding to our next step. Also, don't let it pull too much, simply absorb the excess paint with a moist brush. For our first highlight, we will mix in equal quantities of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. Apply this everywhere but the deepest shadows and wrinkles. Finally, for our final highlight, use pure Kislev Flesh to pick out the most raised details, such as the nose and cheekbones. If you want to learn more about this step, you can Google what's called a T-zone, which is an area of the face that catches the most light, such as the forehead, nose, and cheekbones. For bonus points, pick out the eyes with an off-white color and add a bit of Aethermatic Blue contrast paint to get a cool glow. Finally, add a dot of white in the center of each eye. If you feel uncomfortable doing this, add some Nuln Oil or diluted black paint into the eyes to simulate shadow from the helmet. To paint our base and remaining details, we will paint the metal bars by giving them a heavy dry brush of Vallejo Metal color Gunmetal Gray. If you do not have this paint, Iron Warrior by Games Workshop is a great substitute. After it is dry, which shouldn't take long given we dry brushed it, apply a generous coat of Agric Shade, a shade made by Games Workshop. You can alternatively use Strong Tone by Army Painter to the metal parts to simulate some grime and dirt. Once this is dry, do a light dry brush of the same color as the base coat to add some contrast. Finally, to make things interesting, add some Scrag Brown into the recesses of some bolts to simulate rust. To paint the base itself, start with a black primer and do a heavy dry brush of Storm Vermin Fur or any dark gray that you have. After it is dry, apply a thin layer of Basilicanum Gray contrast paint. Once that is dry, and I mean bone dry, apply a dry brush with a mix of Storm Vermin Fur, Mechanicus Standard Gray, and a bit of light gray. Repeat the process for any concrete details on the figure. Well, there we have it, Magneto in all of his glory, ready to unleash the mutants upon our world. This was an extremely pleasant miniature to paint, and I enjoyed working with all the different textures and materials. Hope you enjoyed this video. Paint alternatives and links will be in the video description. Make sure to stop by Heretic Games over in San Bruno, California if you're local or passing by, and also check out the online store to get your paints and miniatures at heretic-games.com.